Welcome back to another version of Pump the Brakes. My name is Andre Beckles. I am an independent financial consultant with Harare Wealth Management, LLC, based in New York City. I hope everybody is doing well. And let's get into economic news. Let's talk about the last bit of economic news that transpired that affected the marketplace at the end of 2022. So with that being said, let's start off with inflation. Everybody has talked about inflation. It's one of the buzzwords for every home when we talk about the rising prices, or in some cases where prices actually eased off of. But basically, we talked about rising prices all through last year, and that has affected your investment portfolios, everything from your investment portfolios all the way to your refrigerator. So with that being said, let's jump into it. Inflation, otherwise known as CPI, aka the Consumer Price Index. That is one of the leading indicators when we look at movement in the marketplace. So the Consumer Price Index report, the last report that we have was for November of last year. And that rate was 7.1%. And that was up 0.10 for the report for the month of November. Now, 7% is definitely a high number when we look at inflation. The norm that we look at, or has transpired over, let's say, at least 70 years. And what the Federal Reserve is most comfortable with is anywhere between 2 to 3%. And I'll go further into that information in just a moment. So 7.1% was the report that we received for the month of November. That is versus 9.1% that we saw being reported in June of 2022. That was at the height, which by and large is a 40-year high with regards to inflation. As I mentioned, the Federal Reserve looks to target inflation at about 2 to 3%. One will say target, what does that mean? Well, the Federal Reserve is very active in keeping the economy flowing in a certain way. So they're always constantly monitoring through what is called monetary policy, interest rates, amongst many other things. But for our case, we'll focus mainly on interest rates. I always like to say there's a story of Goldilocks and the Three Bears that most people know. Well, the Federal Reserve doesn't like interest rates too hot. They don't like it too cold. They like it just right. Now, of course, you do waver, and in wavering, there are different things that may be transpiring. We may be coming out of a recession or maybe going into a recession. So hence, when we talk about interest rates, when we talk about inflation, those things do move based on interest rates, and of course, also based on the growth of the economy or the lack thereof. So when we look then at the actual report and say, what was most important inside that November inflationary report, the CPI, or the highlights? Well, let's just look at what was very important. Food was up 10.6%. Gas of all forms was up about, say, 10%. I say gas of all forms because you have petrol, you have natural gas. So if we look at petrol, up 65% from the last report. And if we look at natural gas, up 15.5%. Now, gas was definitely a dominant conversation as far as petroleum earlier in 2022, for the mere fact that people were looking at, gas prices being upwards of about, say, $5 a gallon. And if you are in certain parts of the United States, then it was up roughly anywhere from 6 to maybe close to 7 if I look out on the West Coast. So that is something everybody can relate to when I talk about the price of petroleum being higher. The other thing that most people should really focus also on is natural gas, because we're now in the winter season, and depending on where you are, if you're really being affected by weather, meaning colder weather, then you're using more natural gas. You may use natural gas inside your kitchen, but definitely if you're more weather focused and you're using natural gas, let's say for your hot water heater or for your boilers, and of course, again, for your other appliances in the home, then natural gas prices are very important to you. So as I said, up 15.5%. Electricity, which I've touched on before and said, hey, that is a key thing that everybody should pay attention to. I have lights on inside the studio. I'll be quite honest, as soon as I finish recording this vlog for you, I will only use one light because I focus heavily on the price of electricity. And I think most people are right now, as you're getting your electric bills, either for the month of December or rolling into the next month for January. That being said, electricity was up 13.7% for the last report in November. Let's move on to other items such as new vehicles. We talked about vehicle prices and why the prices were so high earlier in 2020, let's say 2021, because of supply shortages, and definitely affected prices in new vehicles, but most importantly also in used vehicles. So pricing on new vehicles for this report up 7.2%. For used vehicles, it actually went down 3.3%. So getting more vehicles out in the lots, having more sales, caused prices of used vehicles being down. I can remember at one point in 2021, 2022, early 2022, prices of used vehicles were up double digits. It nearly made more sense to hold on to your used vehicle, or you may get a real good deal in selling that used vehicle at that time. Let's also then look at apparel. Apparel up 3.6%. Medical up 3%. Shelter, if we look at whether you're leasing or if you're buying a home, shelter was up 7. And that was definitely right in line with inflation, but most importantly, one of the larger expenditures that you also heard people talking about. Transportation up 14%. Now, that was happening because more and more people are out there traveling, whether it be in their vehicles, on trains, buses, planes, so on and so forth, as they felt more comfortable going out inside the environment versus, let's say, a year and a half ago when there were more lockdowns or people were traveling less. So pricing became very, very competitive. Let's move on to what I call the wholesaler price, meaning the individuals that actually produce goods and services. They have their own inflationary rate. It generally is very close to the CPI, but it's called the PPI, the Producer Price Index. So for the producers, if we look at that report, that was up 7% just as well in the month of November. At the height, it was up 8.4%, and that was in March of 2022. So those are your key inflationary data. Next, we'll move on to retail sales. So retail sales is also another leading indicator because it also allows you to see the strength of the consumer, how much a consumer is actually spending money. I won't go into detail as to all the different areas where money is being spent. Let's just focus generically on retail sales. And that was provided by the U.S. Department of Commerce for the month of November. And sales were down 0.6%. It was expected to be down 0.3%. Now, the reason for that is consumers were being more fickle with their money. They definitely were spending money, especially as you're talking about the holiday season, but they weren't spending it, in the same manner. Let's say being more frugal during the season. And maybe it would be you, maybe it's a family member, but generally the consensus was in the month of November leading into December, consumers were being a lot more frugal. And the reason for that is inflation, spending out more money for food. As I talked about, the inflationary rate for food at 10.6%, prices being up 10.6%. So that is one of your main staples. If you think about the roof over your head, costs going up if you're leasing, that's the cost just in general up about 7%. And then if you're talking about food being the next, I think that falls under Maslow's hierarchy of needs, roof over your head, food in your belly. Well, that being said, you're looking at people being more frugal with their budgets and looking at those items. If I'm expending more money there, I'm going to spend less on maybe discretionary items inside retail stores. So that occurred even with retailers providing deep discounts on regular goods because they had a lot of high inventory coming out of the summer into the fall, and definitely in the season going into the great big season where retailers make all of their money. Casualty, I'd say, of recessionary fears, higher interest rates, fear of job losses, uncertainty inside the economy, and as I also mentioned, just higher prices generally. Now, there was also another report that came out, gave another indication of what was going on during a little later in the year. So from November 1st to December 24th, MasterCard came out with a report which provided sales data that illustrated an increase in retail sales of 7.6%. Now that sounds good versus what I just mentioned. However, if we map that versus the previous year, it was a decrease from the previous year where retail sales during that same period was up 8.5%. So you can see once again that there is some contraction based on different things occurring inside the economy. Another key indicator report in the month of November at the end of the year was the unemployment rate. So employment report. So that was provided to us by the Department of Labor, and the unemployment rate at 3.7% in November versus 4.2% the year before. And added 263,000 jobs. Labor participation was at 62%. So we look at the 3.7%, which is the unemployment rate, and you look at the labor force, people participating at 60 and above, where pretty much when we look at the Federal Reserve, and I'm mentioning leading indicators, these are many of the things that the Federal Reserve looks at in their monetary policy, we're pretty much at full employment. You'll say, well, if you're saying people 60% of the people are involved inside, are participating inside the economy, how do you have full employment? Well, if the unemployment rate is at 3.7, that is what you really look at. Subtract that from 100%, you virtually have about 96% of the people that are willing participants inside the economy looking for jobs. That's what creates the indication of full employment. So just before I even touch on a little more information about the Fed, that means that one of the major things that the Federal Reserve looks at is also employment. So this means that you have a stronger economy. You've seen it in previous reports. I've talked about the increase in salaries, and you may hear on the news people talking about, hey, people are changing jobs because they're looking at those fringe benefits. Of course, salary. They're looking at healthcare, getting better healthcare plans. They're looking at retirement benefits. They're looking at days off. They're looking at flexibility and schedule. So these are all the little things that people are looking at. And that basically is where we are when we look at full employment. even though you have people changing jobs in and out, you still are at 3.7. We've kind of teetered between there and say about 3.5%. That is considered full employment. Another very important thing that, and I know I've had many clients that have talked to me about interest rates, thoughts of where they're going, if they're buying a first-time home or if they're buying a secondary home. And we've dealt a lot with interest rates as the economy has been so strong. So, and that's what I was kind of piggybacking from unemployment and talking about what the Fed looks at. Oh, they look also at home sales and how much people are their expenditures, not just in the pricing of homes, but how many homes are being sold. So what I want to talk about right here is home sales for November. This is brought to us by the U.S. Department of Commerce, also the National Association of Retailers, and we look at existing home sales. Now, that existing home sales in the month of November is down for the past 10 consecutive months. So existing home sales, not new home sales, but existing home sales down for the past 10 consecutive months. And as far as sales in the month of November, down 7.7%. And that's down, say, about 35, nearly 35.5% year to date in the month of November as this report came out. Inventory is very low, which again, if you have less inventory out there, could still continue to see prices kind of stay a little higher. I think the next report is going to be very important to see what inventories look at. But inventory was lower by 6.6% to roughly about, say, 1.4 million homes. That equates to a supply of about, say, 3.5 months. The housing turnover rate, how quickly a person was able to sell a home, and it varies, pardon me, state by state, city by city for that fact, but the housing turnover rate was roughly about 24 days. What does that mean? Well, 24 days to turn over a home. And if you take a look at that, that's up from 21 days in the month of October and 18 days from November the previous year. Pardon me while I drink a little water, dry throat. So what you're seeing is more of a lag in the ability to sell homes. So that's what I meant when you're taking a look and you're saying, hey, you're seeing more inventory out there, and it'll be important to see how much in the December report that comes out shortly. The next thing to take a look, as I mentioned, clients talking about interest rates and piggybacking off what I mentioned regarding the Federal Reserve raising rates. Freddie Mac, excuse me, Freddie Mac mortgage rates, and this is as of December 29th of 2022, the 30-year rate was at 6.42%. Juxtaposed to the same date in 2021, the rate was at 3.1%. So we've definitely more than doubled the rate of interest, and hence we see the cooling of the economy. So as I go back to that Goldilocks and the three bears, if the economy is so strong, and you see it in the job market, and you saw it definitely in the housing market earlier, well, once you start raising rates, and it takes a little while for it to really bring about an effect inside the economy. I like to say that every time that the Federal Reserve raises rates, so if you raise, let's say you raise rates in December, it takes usually about, say, 3 to 6 months to really see the true effects. But we definitely see it in regards to higher interest rates and the cooling, as I mentioned, 10 consecutive down months of existing home sales. And just to mention, this illustrates how, the Federal Reserve, they've raised rates within the past year 7 times. That's the Fed fund rate, which really affects everything out into the economy. And that was one thing to kind of cool off the housing market. Housing market was definitely running rampant. And that is just one of the many things that the Federal Reserve looks at as you see inflation. Higher prices, whether it be food or it be the price of housing, that's what the Federal Reserve is trying to tame. If we then look at U.S. housing starts or permits, so single family housing start permits were down 7.1% based on the same report that came out December 21st of 2022 for the month of November. They were down 7.1%, and that's the weakest since 2020. So that means that, yes, interest rates are affecting it. Applications for future construction are down 11.2%. In addition, residential housing starts decline by 0.5%. That's the lowest since May of 2020. So we definitely have entered into what I consider an inflection point. That's a point where we're seeing considerable change inside the economy, and it's affecting various economic areas. That being said, those were the key indicators that I really wanted to touch on. Before I close, I just want to let you know, as you're going to start getting your 401k statements, your retirement statements from me if you're a client, you will see, if you own equities, you're going to see prices for the year over year definitely down. I always like to tell, as family members, as they get their statements, like, well, why are we down? Well, I like to say I'm not a magician. I think that comes from a commercial as well. But if the broader marketplace is down, then you will feel the effects of that. And some of that has a lot to do with, again, interest rates and inflation just as well. So if we look at the major the domestic stock indices, let's take a look at 2022 versus 2021. So let's look at the S&P 500. That's the broader stock market of large, medium, and small size companies, 500 companies based on the actual word, S&P 500. And that was down 18% in 2022. And that is versus the market, the S&P 500 being up 27% in 2021. If we look at the Dow Jones, that's the Dow Jones 30, 30 stocks within that of your larger corporations, that was down 6.86% for all of 2022. And that's juxtaposed to in 2021, the Dow Jones 30 being up 18.7%. The NASDAQ, which is a much broader picture, even broader than the S&P 500, because it's comprised of roughly about, say, 3,300 stocks, large, medium, and small size. That was down 32.5%. And that's juxtaposed to being up 21.4% in 2021. You may ask, hey, why is that down so much? Well, you have more tech-heavy, or I should say it is more tech-heavy weighted index, meaning you have more technology companies in there. And tech definitely is truly affected by higher interest rates, a lot of it because of funding, but just in general, tech tends to be also more aggressive. So that being said, that's why the index is down a lot more. The Russell 2000, which is comprised of small size companies domestically, that was down 20.46% for 2022. And in 2021, that was up 16.3%. The last index, because I always like to say we don't just invest in domestic stocks, we take a look at the Morgan Stanley Capital International Index, which it's also called the MSCI EFA, and EFA stands for the Europe, Australia, Far East Index. So that's one of the oldest international equity/stock indexes. indices, I should say. And that for 2022 was down 14.35%, versus it being up 11.25% in 2021. So that covers all of the stock performances. Regarding the bond index, I like to say by and large, or should I say bonds in general. So if you have mutual funds that consist of either corporate or treasury, or if you have a portfolio of municipal securities, by and large, those were also down, especially if you have longer-term bonds. Longer-term bonds also have tend to have more volatility than your shorter range bonds. So with higher interest rates, that generally affects the pricing of bonds. So that meant that yes, especially if you're taking income from those type of funds, then you're benefiting from a higher rate of interest, but it has meant that during that time frame, you definitely saw a depreciation of the pricing of those bonds. So let's take a look next before we close out at U.S. Treasury bond rates as of 12/31. And this just kind of goes back to where we were talking about interest rates and where I'm going to close out on what's called the federal funds rate. The 10-year U.S. Treasury, which is a major barometer, as of 12/31/22, the 10-year U.S. Treasury had a yield, a rate of 3.88% versus a year ago at the same time at 1.5%. The 30-year, as of December 31st of 2022, that was at 3.94%. That was the yield. And that's juxtaposed to the year before at 1.91%. So you see that we've definitely been affected in the sense of having 7 rate increases by the Federal Reserve, where you see much higher rates of interest. And next, when I talk about higher rates of interest, you may not always hear the term Fed funds rate, but Fed funds rate is basically what the Federal Reserve, when we talk about monetary policy, what they are doing when they're raising rates. So if you hear that, once a month the Fed is meeting, and this Tuesday or Wednesday they're going to come out and mention if they're going to raise rates. Well, the Fed funds rate is basically one of the tools that they have in their toolbox. It is basically the rate of interest that financial institutions, whether it be your commercial banks, your savings and loans, your other smaller banks, that's how they lend money and maintain liquidity inside that market. It's like your overnight market, so to speak, where they're lending money to each other. That rate is at 4.5%, and that last rate increase was at 0.5%. Some of the previous increases were at 0.75%. So again, the reason for the raising rates, the reason for raising rates has a lot to do with a strong economy and high inflation. It's great to have a strong economy, but you can't have it where pricing is just continuously goes up and it's affecting everybody's pockets. That's your inflation. So that's the reason why you hear the Fed constantly talking about raising rates. It, yes, does negatively impact many times your stock portfolio and can affect also your bond portfolio. But it is par for the course of going through what I like to say is a change inside the economy. Many times can lead to either a very strong recession or a mild recession inside our domestic or global markets. And one of the things I like to mention, I always talk with the Federal Reserve here in the United States where I'm based, but it also affects, it affects, their raising rates can affect what happens overseas. But if you look at the European Union, that central bank there also, is dealing with inflation. I like to say, hey, we're not we're not alone in this situation with inflation. Many people are feeling some of the same pains with higher costs, and their central banks, just like the Federal Reserve, they're also raising interest rates to cool off that higher demand. So let's close up the show. I think I went a little bit longer than I expected. With that being said, in closing the show, where are we going to go from there? What's going to be some of the dominant news that you're going to hear in 2023, conversations that may influence the economy and the marketplace? Well, monetary policy, the Federal Reserve, raising of interest rates, inflation, jobs, consumer spending, how strong the economy is. That is one of the key things that you'll hear from. The second is fiscal policy. That is what your legislators actually work on. All right. Well, we hope they're working on that, be the fact. With legislation that can be enacted to strengthen the economy, and also will deal with whether it be social spending, economic policies, taxation, job growth, so on and so forth. That is part of the fiscal policy, and hopefully that is something that legislators will also be working on. It can be just as small as the cutting of the taxes, whether it be locally in your neighborhood, but also as small as the gas tax where you are, so that you're not feeling all of the ills of inflation. So that is something that you'll also hear. Geopolitical events, basically global events that will take place that can be political. Well, you definitely know what's going on in Ukraine. Things are going on all throughout the world, and many of them affect what I always like to say is oil prices and gas prices, which again can affect the marketplace. Corporate earnings. Now, most people would have thought that I talk about that first. Well, all that being said, if the market is down, generally it has some effects, or if you're having some type of contraction inside the economy, well, that's also going to affect how much not just individuals but also corporations are spending their money. So that is something that we'll look at as we see, especially forthcoming fourth quarter reports of how well companies have done with their profits. So that is something that will also be in the headlines. And many people will say, well, Andre, all of these are the things that you talk about. Well, these are the things that are going to be dominant inside the headlines. Most importantly, I would like to say for consumers and investors, stability and less volatility inside the marketplace. If we have less volatility, there's less unknown, and that kind of gets us moving in the right direction. Some people will look and say, hey, how long will this really affect the portfolio that I have? Well, we haven't had a major recession, although we did have two consecutive periods of contraction within our GDP, the gross domestic product, which is your technical recession, but by and large, you still had a very strong economy. So we shall see what transpires, and I look to get back to you a lot sooner with the next vlog, so within the month, to let you know, hey, how the fourth quarter really ended, and what we're seeing in corporate earnings, and also good sales ideas as to where you can be investing your money. So with that being said, my name again is Andre Beckles. This is Pump the Brakes. Andre Beckles with Harari Wealth Management. If you like this video, please share it with a friend. If they have questions, by all means, you can give them my email or my telephone number, which is in the bio for this video. Otherwise, hey, peace and blessings until the next time we speak again. Take care.